So you've all heard of Mark Twain, I assume. Does anybody know what the name means?
Yes. Yeah.
What's it mean?
It means when they on a boat, when they want to see how deep the water was, they would weigh that and walk the deck by having a string to weigh the bottom of the belt. The 12 feet deep enough to draft and boat the next. Right.
That's right.
2 fathoms.
2 fathoms. How much is that?
6 feet.
What?
6 feet.
12 feet. 12 feet. So his name translates out as 12 feet in nautical talk. Okay? She was either adjusting the mic or trying to hit me in the nose or biting my nose, one of those. Mark Twain, I read up on him. I've read a number of his books. Today I'm going to be reading some excerpts. He wrote about 30 books, so I'm only going to do one chapter from each of the books. So I hope you have no plans for this evening. When I was reviewing his biography, I realized I've outlived him. He died in 1910. I'm still here. But also, I've lived more years than he has. And looking at all the photographs of Mark Twain, that's scary. My talk today is going to have some humor, and I find his stuff still funny. Some of it's dated, but I find it still funny. I hope you do. I'm going to include his thoughts on patriotism and religion and trigger alert. This includes politics, sex, race, and blasphemy. You've been warned. The most popular things and the most frequently banned is Huck Finn, because he used the language of the day and when he had people talking and stuff. He was most famous for Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer, but he lived a long time after that. I'm going to be talking mostly about the stuff he did at the beginning and the end, which I find most interesting. And his first bestseller wasn't Tom Sawyer or Huck Finn. It was Innocents Abroad, which is about a trip to Europe he made. And he read in the paper, he was working for a newspaper in New York, and he read that there was a ship that was going to do a tourist thing, where they would take people to Europe, go around the Mediterranean, and have guided tours of different places. And this is like the first cruise ship kind of thing, where you don't just go from one place to another, but each stop they take you around and show you stuff and then go on to the next one. And he thought, gee, that would be wonderful. And he talked his editor into paying his passage for this, and he would send back a story once a month about what he's been seeing. And he later collected it in the book, Innocents Abroad. And then one time when Rose and I were going to take a trip to Europe, I read this because it covered many of the places we were going to go. And I thought it was hilarious. For example, in Venice, they have the gondoliers and they sing. And he managed to get the only gondolier who couldn't sing worth anything in all of Venice. And as they cruised past the other gondoliers, they would always mock them out for picking that guy. And the thing I thought was really funny was in Genoa. Usually on a cruise, you go on these little tours and stuff, and you hang out with people that you've been hanging out with because you're familiar with them and you don't want to hang out with the weirdo guy. But there's people that hung out with Mark Twain, and in Venice they got a tour of a museum, and the local guy, a guy from Genoa, he did the tour of the museum. This is where Christopher Columbus came from, and They had a lot of stuff about Columbus. And I will now read to you, not being able to imitate Mark Twain's Missouri speech. I probably should have got you to do this. But Twain writes, "The guide's eyes sparkled. He danced about us and tapped the parchment with his finger. What I tell you, gentlemen, is it not so? See, handwriting, Christopher Colombo, write it himself." We looked indifferent, unconcerned. The doctor, one of his fellow passengers, examined the document very deliberately during a painful pause, then said, without any show of interest, what did you say the name of the party was who wrote this? Christopher Colombo, the great Christopher Colombo. He wrote it himself, Christopher Colombo, his own handwriting. The doctor then laid the document down and said, "Why, I have seen boys in America only 14 years old that can write better than that. But this is the great Christopher. I don't care who he is. It's the worst writing I ever saw. Now, you mustn't think you can impose upon us because we are strangers. We are not fools by a good deal. If you have got any specimens of penmanship of real merit, then trot them out." The guide was considerably shaken up, but he made one more venture. "Ah, look, gentlemen, beautiful grand bust of Christopher Colombo. Beautiful bust, beautiful pedestal. What did you say this gentleman's name was?" "Christopher Colombo, the great Christopher Columbus." Christopher Colombo, the great Christopher Columbus. Well, what did he do? Discover America! Discover America! That's what Twain says. Discover America. No, that statement will hardly wash. We are just from America ourselves. We have heard nothing about this. Christopher Colombo? Pleasant name. Is he dead? Oh, 300 years. Are his parents living? And Twain says, that joke was lost on the foreigner. Guides cannot master the subtleties of the American joke. I found that out in my travels. And then, being this is a religious institution, I've collected a few thoughts that Twain had on religion. And if you're easily offended, please do not pull out weapons. He gave his thoughts on what Christians think of heaven. They have tranquilly accepted this kind of heaven without thinking, without reflection, without examination. And they actually want to go to it. Profoundly devout, old gray-haired men put a large part of their dreaming of the happy day when they will lay down the cares of this life and enter into the joys of that place. Yet you can see how unreal it is to them and how little it takes a grip upon them as being fact, for they make no practical preparations for the great change. You never see one of them with a harp and they don't like to sing. As you have seen, the singular show is a service of praise, praise by hymn, praise by prostration. It takes the place of church. Now then, in the earth, these people cannot stand much church. An hour and a quarter is the limit, and they draw the line at once a week. That is to say, Sunday. 1 day in 7, and even then, they do not look forward to it with longing. And so consider what their heaven provides them for them. Church that lasts forever and a Sabbath that has no end. In 1909, he wrote a book called Letters of the Earth. He died the next year, was not yet published. His surviving daughter, he had 3 daughters, 2 of them died in the 20s while Twain was still alive, broke his heart. His one daughter was the executor of his will, and she did not allow this book to be published until 1962. And strangely enough, the Jesuit college that I got my master's degree at in Buffalo, this was one of the 2 impulse items at the checkout counter at the bookstore. Very anti-religious tract, but that was the impulse items. It was that and a long poem by Robert Burns that was considered obscene by most Catholics, but I bought both of these. Letters of the Earth, he quotes from Deuteronomy 2013, where God is commanding, lay siege to that city. When the Lord your God has delivered it into your hands, you must put every male to the sword. But women, children, livestock, and whatever else is in a city, all is spoil. You may take it as plunder, and you shall use the spoil of your enemies that the Lord your God has given you. And Twain says, according to the belief of these people, it was God himself who said, thou shalt not kill. Then it is plain he cannot keep his own commandments. And later he quotes from Numbers 31, where the Lord commanded an attack on a city called Midian. And this is Moses telling them the Lord God has commanded to attack the city. Now therefore kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman that hath known man by lying with him. But all the women and children that have not known a man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. And they warred against the Midians as the Lord commanded Moses, and they slew all the males. And the children of Israel took all the women of Midian captives and the little ones. And Twain comments, the heaviest punishment at all was meted out to the persons who could not by any possibility deserve so horrible a fate, the 32,000 virgins who were subject to a physical examination to determine their status, enslaved, and used by their captives for immoral purposes. And then on the subject of women, he was probably one of the biggest feminists of his age. He, in his personal life, he respected women. He had 3 daughters. He loved his wife. He listened to her advice and followed it very closely, except when she edited his later works because she was of a higher social class and tried to edit out the vulgarities. And sometimes she would say, you can't use that word. And he would just use another word that she didn't know to slip it past her. So, he met Helen Keller, who, as a teenager, was invited. Some rich guy had a party and was showing her off. She was deaf and blind, and had a teacher named Sullivan who managed to figure out, Miss Sullivan managed to figure out how to communicate with her. And she was able to understand people when they talk, have conversations with people. She was a very smart woman. And when everyone went into the party, she would shake their hands and stuff. And then leaving the party, the host said, now as you leave, shake her hand, and she will be able to say who it is if she's shaking her hand. There was about 5 people that left, and she was able to tell, oh, this is Mr. So-and-so, Mr. So-and-so. And Mark Twain, being Mark Twain, decided this was some parlor trick. So he walked up, and he patted her on the head. And she said, oh, that must be Mr. Twain. And he was amazed by this. She never told him how she was able to identify him, but she recognized the smell from the cigar he was smoking. she never told him his whole life. And when she wanted to go to college, I forget what college she went to, but anybody know? When he went to, she wanted to go to college, and the college was reluctant to accept her because she was blind and deaf. And he wrote a letter so convincing the college accepted her. And then he hit up all his rich friends to make donations to pay her tuition. And she always loved Mark Twain and said nice things about him. Also, on the subject of the relationship to women, he goes back and talks about the Bible and said, Solomon, who was one of the deity's favorites, had 700 wives and 300 concubines. To save his life, he could not have kept two of these young creatures satisfactorily refreshed. Said the Creator intended the women to be constricted to one man. And he does this without consulting the women, although she has 1,000 times more at stake than he has. So Mark Twain eventually became the most famous author in the United States and known throughout the world, and maybe the most famous author in the world. But he was one of the 19th century worst investors. He kept putting his money on really dumb things, losing his money, writing another book to try to recover. Eventually, he got deeply in debt, and he had to declare bankruptcy. And his wife convinced him that this is not something a person of merit does, and you need to pay all these people back. And he realized, okay, that they can't keep coming after me or declare bankruptcy. People have gotten so much on the dollar, wherever it was located. But he decided he needed to pay everybody back, and how he did it was to what was called mount a platform, and that is give lectures. And he did it throughout the world. He crossed the United States, stopping in big cities and little tiny mining camps and giving lectures. And Canada, took a boat to Australia, went around Australia, took a boat to New Zealand. Then after that, went to South India, what's now Pakistan, South Africa, and back to England. And it was over a year. He delivered many lectures and was able to pay off his debts. And then, of course, made bad investments. Had to sell his house in Hartford. But for a while there, he was honorable again because he had paid off all his debts, which is unusual for people at any time wanting to do when they're bankruptcy. And we'll go over the whole trip, but in India, he loved the people. He had a few incidents, like he was staying in a hotel room, his wife and daughter stayed in one room, he stayed in another, and two monkeys came in the room. And he mentions to one monkey he was content to go through his stuff and see what he had, but the other monkey threw things at him. So he's Mark Twain, he throws things back at the monkey. Eventually the monkeys leave. And he was remarked they had these religious statues that were very long, slender poles, and he called them phalluses, but or lingams in the local language. We have a picture. If you can find the picture I sent, you can see what this is, but his description goes on for a little bit. And this is in Calcutta. And talks about, it is a fluted candlestick 250 feet high. This lingam is the only large monument in Calcutta, I believe. It is a fine ornament and will keep oligarchy in mind. It's a long British name, Alton Wadi. Wherever you are in Calcutta and for miles around, you can see it. And always when you see it, you will think of Akamaki. And there's not an hour of the day you did not think of Akamaki and wonder who he was. And this was that's a picture? Okay. We don't have a picture, but
It's coming. The picture's coming.
okay, we'll see it later.
One moment. Zoom host says 1 moment.
This turned out was a British officer that killed some Indian people, and so they built this big monument to him. And he talked about this one other British officer who had, with 3,000 soldiers, had killed 60,000 and founded an empire. And there's no monuments to this guy. And Twain says that he doesn't suspect that this is his monument. Heaven is sweet and peaceful to him. This is sort of the unfairness of it all. You die, you get the monument, you don't know.
Here's the photo.
There's the photo. You can see that's very impressive for somebody, who was this guy? Like the Washington Monument, you see it, you know who Washington is. And in India, he met a holy man. And he took great joy in meeting this person who is a living God. He'd never met a living God before. And Twain talks about the Swami having achieved perfection through various long stages of family life study, begging, desert dwelling as a hermit in meditation, and could not be defiled by contact with a person of a lower caste, even a Presbyterian. And as Twain described, as soon as I sobered down a little, we got along very well. And I found him a most pleasant and friendly deity. He proposed an exchange of autographs, a delicate attention which made me believe in him, but I had been having my doubts before. So, moving on, he goes to, we're talking about another theme of his, and this is like the last one, is nationalism and imperialism. And when in Huck Finn, there's an escaped slave called Jim. I will not use the pejorative of the time to describe what they called people of his race, but and Huck Finn was a poor young man who escaped an abusive family situation, and they shared a raft together. Huck didn't treat him with very much respect, and then eventually realized the humanity and that this was his friend. And they're going down the river, and they have this raft. It's a rather large raft. He has a little canoe, and he goes to shore looking for some provisions and leaves Jim because Jim would be apprehended as an escaped slave. And some slave catchers came up the river, and they stopped Huck, and they asked him about this. And what is that yonder? A piece of a raft, I said. This is Huck's hands. Do you belong on it? Yes, sir. Any men on it? Only one, sir. Well, there's 5 Jurgis. Run off tonight up yonder above the head of the bend. Is your man white or black? And Huck doesn't answer right away. His whole upbringing, his religious training, that slavery was bequeathed by God, helping a slave was a sin, and lying was a sin, and you would lose your soul and be condemned forever. And then finally, Huck thinks that he's not going to betray a friend, and he thinks to himself, all right then, I'll go to hell. And he says he's white. and his slave catchers didn't go and check it out. And he says he's very sick and we need to get him to a doctor. And they actually gave him money to pay for a doctor. So he outsmarted the slave catchers. And then in Tom Sawyer, he talks about Tom Sawyer had read about the Crusades, and he thought it was current events. Something just happening because he hadn't heard about it before, and he's trying to talk Huck into joining him and going to fight the Crusades. And Huck hadn't heard anything about the Crusades, and he explains they need to get the Holy Land back from the people that are there, and give it back to the Christians and the Jews. Huck says, it seems to me that if I had a farm and it was my farm and belonged to me, and another fellow wanted it, would it be right for him to take it? And Tom says, they own the land, just the mere land, and that's all that you own. But it was our folks, the Jews and Christians, that made it holy. And so they haven't any business being there. It's a shame, and we ought to not stand for a minute. We ought to march against them and take it away from them. And then Huck says, well, it does seem to me that it's the most mixed up thing I ever saw. Now, if I had a farm and another person, and Tom keeps telling him about why they should wage war and take the Holy Land, but Huck keeps coming back and saying, well, if it's their farm and their land, it's theirs. He doesn't quite get the concept. And the trip that, this is the last page, the trip that Mark Twain was taking around the world, they got to Australia and then he went to New Zealand and he met a man, Michael Davitt. There's a statue of him in San Francisco. He was an Irish patriot. He was born poor, and he was going to the different English-speaking places where the Irish wound up because the famine and trying to raise money for the starving people in England. Michael Davitt eventually got elected to Parliament, but they didn't want an Irish Catholic in Parliament, so they jailed him and talked about stealing an election. And he's fine-tuning his innate feelings he had against imperialism at this point. And this was a big effect on him. And when he got to New Zealand, he saw a statue of a Maori, the local indigenous person. And this guy, the inscription on the statue said that he fought for the English against his own people. So he gets a statue here, he died fighting for the English. And Twain thought they ought to tear this statue down and reduce it to rubble. This man betrayed his own people for the foreign invader. And tearing down statues of Confederates and stuff, that's not like a new thing here. But in Africa, he was just totally appalled at what the British were doing in South Africa. And he had talked about Cecil Rhodes, who was the big colonizer in Africa, and says, he raids and robs and slays and enslaves the natives and gets worlds of Christian applause for it. They burn incense to him as the eventual God of plenty, and an archangel with wings to half the world, Satan with a tail to the other hand. I admire him, I frankly confess, and when his time comes, I shall buy a piece of the rope as a souvenir. He was, hoping to find him at the end of the rope. And in South Africa, upon reading a British newspaper reporting a military victory over the indigenous people, Twain said, the dispatch writers word their accounts with grandiose military phraseology proper to a real war. They see nothing ludicrous in applying these mere assassinations. And from what he could tell from the news reports, most battles ended with something like, as Twain says, a great slaughter of helpless natives on one side, on the other, a horse killed and a man wounded. And a few years later, we had the Spanish-American War where we took Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines. At the same time, the British had the Boer War where they took the lands in South Africa that were originally settled by the Dutch, and they took that away from them. In 1900, Twain was asked to introduce the 26-year-old Winston Churchill. And Churchill was a war correspondent during the Boer Wars and spoke highly about the British, their glory and such, but they got the wrong guy, I think, to introduce Winston Churchill, because he started out talking about the common virtues between the United States and England and the shared culture and stuff, and then mentioned the Boer War and the U.S. Atrocities in the Philippines, and said the U.S. and Britain now share the same sin. And that was his comments on imperialism. And I have 30 more books I would read from, but I edited some of this. So at the end, you saw the great monument, whatever his name was. And any comments or anything? We'll take your questions.
Any comments? Reply for Patrick? I think Hollis was first, and you'll be next.
Thank you, Patrick. I really enjoy Mark Twain. He was over in Europe for a while, and in the U.S. they thought, oh, he must have died. So he found out about this, and he said, the rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated. And he had a rather tragic life. Yeah, he invested in this contraption. It was a printing press, and it just never worked. One of the most tragic things was he had a daughter who was institutionalized, and she finally said, can I come live with you? He said, of course you can. She was in a tub and had an epileptic fit and drowned. He had some rough times, and yet he still kept a great sense of humor.
Want me to bring the mic to you?
Yeah. I want to thank you for your presentation. He's one of my favorite dead poets and writers, Mark Twain. His connection to the Unitarian Church is well known. And I know you didn't have too much time to go into it. He was friends with Emerson and a few other people. I think it was an excellent presentation, given the scope of information it provided. Thank you so much.
There are so many famous quotes from Mark Twain. One of my favorites is, he said, there's nothing that is worse for a good story than an eyewitness.
Markley.
He's one of my favorite American authors, and I'm pretty sure that he was a UU. One of my favorite sayings from him is linked to the field that I'm in, and it's that travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness.
Excellent. Anyone else have a comment or question for Patrick? Well, I just want to say, I think at that time, the only way to get around the world was by boat. And the amount of travel he did, and the contributions in his writing that do that travel. traveling by boat. I think it's quite neat. Anyone
Uh,
else?
I guess I just have to speak up because I don't see that you see my hand. Okay, Patrick, can you hear me now? Patrick?
I can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay. Patrick, I'm Lydia over here, and I want to thank you for bringing to light a lot of the small stories that we didn't learn in the history books. My family was extremely proud to have followed Mark Twain and Samuel Clemens' career. And just for a very brief time, in all the clutter and stuff that was saved, from my grandmother, I think Mary Adams' grandmother, not even sure if it was my grandmother on my father's side or my grandmother on my mother's side, but we had an actual newspaper which was describing one of those lectures he gave. And I remember I was like, just so fascinated. The paper was crumbling, and here's this photograph or early photography. And this man was just so incredibly beyond comprehension at how brilliant he was and how universal his views were. And then you'd see people maligning him because he mismanaged money, didn't have a clue how to invest, and maybe picking a remark he might have made or the language he used in his books as being racist and other things that were just so devastating. I don't know what he felt or how he felt when those things were leveled at him, if he just passed them off and knew better, or if his heart was broken several times. I just don't know, and I wish we did know. I'd like to say, Patrick, I hope you have a script, because I would very, very much appreciate reading it. The acoustics in the hall over Zoom are difficult for those of us here to hear everything you've said. So kindly make it available, and we'll see you next time we get over there. Thanks for your great, great research and kindly, honest presentation of one of the great men of our times.
Thank you. The thing I like about Mark Twain is that as he got older, he got less conservative, which unfortunately doesn't always happen with people. I think if we have any more questions, we should do it during the coffee period. And